When you animate a positional property such as position or anchor point, you get what's known as a motion path, and we're going to have a look at motion paths and how to control them now. If you want to follow along, you can open up Motion Paths AEP, and you can find that in the Animation Basics folder. And in here we have a few layers that we've animated, and these two layers here have their position properties animated. And we can see a motion path up here in the composition panel. If we want to see that a bit more clearly, what we can do is select the layer and go to Edit, Label, and if we change the label colour to something quite bright, like a red colour or an orange colour maybe, you'll see that we get a much brighter, more obvious motion path. So this is the motion path, and at the moment that motion path, you notice there's dots on it, and those dots are evenly spaced. So that tells me that it's moving at an even speed and in a straight line between these 2 points. These squares at the end of the motion path represent the keyframes, and if I select them, you'll notice I select them down in the timeline as well. If I select them down in the timeline, notice they become selected up here in the composition panel. So when it's filled, it's selected. When it's unfilled, it's unselected. So you can select them up here or down here. Now these are what are called spatial keyframes, and these are called temporal keyframes. So 2 different keyframes, but they're linked together. So these determine how the keyframes behave within time, so how the timing works, and these ones up in the composition panel that are linked to these ones determine how things happen in terms of the space. Okay? So for example, I could move this keyframe, and that changes its position, but notice it doesn't affect its timing down in the timeline. I'm just going to undo that. So you can pick up keyframes and move them. If I decide I want the text layer to come from down here or up here, I can move the first keyframe, and then when I scrub through, you'll notice the text now comes in from there instead. So you can just pick up and move keyframes spatially. What else can you do? Well, you'll notice, if you look very carefully, there are another couple of squares here. Now, if you want to see these handles and path points a little bit more clearly, we can go into our preferences, into general preferences, and we can change the path point size up to the maximum of 15 pixels, which I believe is the maximum for this. And that makes them a lot bigger. So while you're learning about keyframing, you may want to make these bigger, and then that makes it really obvious where your keyframes are and where the handles to adjust them are. So what do these handles do? Well, these are Bezier handles, and if you've used an application like Adobe Illustrator to create vector files, or you've used paths in Photoshop, you may be familiar with these. Basically, you click and drag them to create a curved path, and it's almost like pulling on an elastic band. Pulling in and out determines how much curve you add, and pulling round like this determines the angle. So I could decide, okay, I want it to pull down a little bit before it comes in to halt. I can also pull this one as well. So it moves it down a little bit further before it comes in. So I'm determining the curve that that text follows. And you'll see now, instead of moving along a straight path, it's actually moving along a curved path, coming into my composition. We can also do the same with this layer here. So again, we can label it to make it clearer. So we'll label this one red, and you'll see that as I select the keyframes, the handles appear. So when it's deselected, the handles won't appear, okay? When I select a keyframe, the handles appear, and that allows me just to click and drag them and decide where I want that to go. So I might want that going in an S-shaped curve, so I can drag the handles that way. And if we preview that, we'll see now that comes in on a slightly more interesting path. So using curved paths instead of straight paths can add a little bit more interest to the animation. And we'll see other ways of creating motion paths using Motion Sketch a little later.